that this can be the preliminary results that are going in the direction that he was indicating that is an interesting direction for the future work in the area. I have, as you can see, a lot of co-authors that have been involved in this work. We have, I think, for what last time also, Tobias was in the chat room. So if you have questions while I'm talking, you can ask questions in the chat room, and Tobias, I'm sure, will be able to respond. So I'm pretty excited about this work. This became a bit of a personal effort, and is trying to analyze at a macro scale the trends that are happening within the MOOC ecosystem. The first slide is dedicated to all the researchers or institutions that have contributed to this work, which is started a bit of a kind of a jump into the emptiness. And I didn't know if this was something that could actually happen and become a true research study. So I'm very grateful to all of the people that have been involved and have collaborated and made this research possible. Within the area of the MOOC research, I think that many of the educational data miners or learning analytics researchers became very excited. We were coming from a research area where we had virtual learning environments with 20 or 30 students. And suddenly in MOOC environments, we had thousands of students that know the world very easily. So we had plenty of data to start doing research. However, most of this research also was focused on learner modeling with algorithmic approaches. The majority of the studies were observational without intervention, so it was hard to make an inference about what was actually happening. Then we have other issues like the anonymity of these OER environments decrease the confidence of the kind of work that have been conducted in the area of MOOCs. And in general, there are so many cores and human factors that is actually very hard to generalize the findings of each study. So in this work, we are focusing on which of the trends that we've seen repetitively in the area of MOOCs are universal, and which of these trends might be context dependent. The problem that we saw is that most of the research have been focused on single courses, or perhaps in numerous courses, but from the same provider. And also we have studies with literature reviews that make very hard to compare research studies that analyze data with different analysis or methodological approaches. So it's very hard to compare also in these studies. And then another issue is that if you take a look to most of the MOOC research, the spotlight has been strongly on the main MOOC providers in the area, like edX, FutureLearn, or Coursera. And so the framing of this work is around the idea of macro, meso, and micro, which was introduced by Buckingham Sham in an UNESCO report where learning analytics could have an impact at these three levels. A bit later on, it was Drashler and Kals that they mapped these three stages into MOLAC, a framework that was mapping these three stages into the MOOC area. And in the MOOC area, we have micro level that is trying to understand learners at an individual level, or perhaps within an individual course. We have the meso level, which is trying to make inference from a higher amount of MOOCs within the perhaps an entire institution, or perhaps even a country. And then we have the macro level, which is trying to offer analytics that can inform the whole community. We think that this study fits well within this macro level, because we are trying to look at things from a global perspective that can inform the whole community. Originally, MOOCs were had the mission to educate the world globally. The idea was that by creating courses online that were completely free, these courses could be consumed by learners that didn't have access to proper education. However, most of the research have suggested that learners in need struggle to complete these courses or even to access them. previous research that I conducted that was sort of the spin-off of this work was focusing on Arab learners, comparing Arab learners in MITx and HarvardX in a track. Some of the findings of this work were that the Arab learners in a drag had better engagement metrics. They also had, they were able to reach lower educated learners, least educated learners, and also the gender gap disappeared in the case of a drag. So in general, in this paper, we concluded that the regional MOOC providers might actually be playing a different role within the MOOC ecosystem. And now in this work, we are trying to be more ambitious and expanding the list of global MOOC providers that we're reaching to actually compare the differences in these global and regional MOOC settings. So the way that we've been doing this is by following a replication approach that allows apples to apples comparison. And one of the issues of MOOC research, or in general learning analytics, is that people apply their own methodologies in each one of their studies, and then it's very hard to transfer what we learn from one study to another, or to compare it in a trustworthy way because the methods are very different. So what we did is that we define a number of common variables regarding the demographics. We define also a number of participation variables and the Human Development Index from the United Nations. In this case, for this first study, we focus only on the demographics. The rest is still to come in future research. And the procedure that we follow is that we first launch a call for partners, which is something that I want to show to you. We initially launched this call from partners from the MIT Teaching Systems Lab. We were looking for people with access to large amounts of MOOC data. We were asking for people with at least access to 50 MOOC iterations. We were offering these people to partner with us in order to study these differences across global and regional MOOC settings, collaborating in this study, and co-authoring publications. One of the issues was the privacy concerns, which I'll get into it a bit later. And one thing that I wanted to point out is that this was a bit of what I said before, a jump into the emptiness, because despite we reached some colleagues that we already knew, I also called, knock in the email inbox of lots of people and have meetings with a lot of MOOC providers trying to convince them that this was interesting research to do. And so it was an interesting process, and I share some of the conclusions that I got from this process later on in the conclusions. So we launched this call for partners, and to avoid the privacy concerns, what we were asking is researchers should save their data into the same format. Then we collaboratively generate a common script, which was a Python script for analysis. This Python script is expecting exactly the same data format for every MOOC provider, and we execute it. And then we only share high-level aggregate data that doesn't contain any private individual information from the students. And so this diagram has a bit of the methodology process that we follow. We started with this call for partners, reaching out lots of colleagues and institutions. Then the people that agreed to be part of this study, we asked them to transform their data. They have access to their own MOOC platform and they have their own data, and we asked them to put their data into the common format. Then the project lead, that in this case it was me, I prepared a script to process this data, and as I said, this script is expecting that the MOOC data is in exactly the same format that we indicated at the beginning of the call for partners. Each partner executes the script on their MOOC data. They get the results, and then they send these results to the project lead that can join the data from all of the MOOC providers together and perform the analysis. This was an iterative process that we went over it 2 or 3 times. because maybe you don't have the entire specification of analysis that you want to perform at the first try. And then once the research is finished, we go forward, we pursue and start writing the paper. So after this process, this is the data collection that we got. I make a difference between the scope of the platforms. We have global providers that are targeting a global audience that are mainly teaching courses in English. Then we also have the number of MOOC instances per MOOC provider and the number of learners. So we have around 9 to 10 million learners, which is a high number and makes this study probably one of the studies that have gathered one of the largest data collections thus far. So on the provider side, we have on the global providers targeting a global audience, we have HarvardX and MITx, FutureLearn, OpenHPI, which is based in Germany, OpenSAP, which is the platform of SAP company, OpenWho, which is from the World Health Organization. And then we have what we've called global institutions that are in global providers, but are targeting a more regional audience. We have, for example, HEC Paris, which is a French university teaching courses mostly in French and in English on Coursera. We have the UPB Valencia institution, the Universidad Politécnica de Valencia institution on edX, which is teaching courses in English, but also in Spanish. And then we have what we've called as regional or local platforms which target much more specific populations. And we have a DRAG, which is an Arabic platform focusing only on the Arab world. We have UPBX, which is also a platform run by the University of Valencia, but it's a local instance of OpenEdX, which teaches courses on Spanish and Valencian mainly. We have Chuetan, mainly in Chinese. We have MOOC House, mainly teaching in German, and the Chinese MOOC teaching in Chinese. So this is the data collection that we got, and now we go to review the results. So in this chart, what we have are the top 10 most representative countries for each one of the platforms. And then we have codified by the color, the region of the country. So we have in the x-axis each one of the providers and the top 10 most representative countries. And then, for example, here, this would represent that the USA, that 30% of the learners of MITx HarvardX come from the USA. So there are a number of things that we can point out from this chart. First one is that we see certain similarities in which are the most representative countries for each one of the global MOOC providers. For example, we see that in MITx and HarvardX and in FutureLearn, we see that USA represents 30% and FutureLearn UK represents 30%. We see the emphasis of edX platform being more focused on the US and FutureLearn being more focused in the European market. We also see some of the trends finding that the main representative countries across the global providers are India, Brazil, USA, UK, Germany, and so on. Perhaps one difference is the platform from the Open World Health Organization, which has a more distributed population around countries that are not that representative in others, probably due to the scope of the platform, like Nigeria, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and so on. Then another interesting thing is the special case of these institutions that are located in a global platform but are targeting a specific regional population with a bit more emphasis. For example, we see HEC Paris on Coursera, which is reaching mostly French learners. We also see UPBX Valencia on edX, which is reaching mostly Hispanic learners. In general, we see that there is an important regional focus of the in the rest of the regional MOOC providers from the regions. For example, we see also that the MOOC House platform has mainly German learners, similar to OpenHPI, that the drag has learners from, all of their learners are from the Arab world, similarly to Chuetan from China, and then the Chinese MOOC also mainly from China, but also some learners from other Asia and learners focused, located in USA. Then another interesting trend that we found was the more international Hispanic audience in UPV Valencia, which is located on edX, compared to UPVX in the local platform of the Universidad Politécnica Valencia. Despite the courses that are teaching in both platforms are highly similar because they are reusing their context from edX in their local platforms, we can see the impact that being located, that teaching your courses in a global platform is making, that is reaching a much more diverse international audience from the Hispano-American countries. The next chart that we see is focused on the level of education by provider. One thing to point out here is that we had to stick to the 4 most representative levels of educations because each platform codifies their level of education in different ways. So it was very difficult to compare some of the levels of education across providers. So we focus on the 4 main levels of education with a doctorate, a master, a bachelor, or high school, junior high school, elementary school education. And then we see this level of education distributed per region, which is on the x-axis, and in each one of the MOOC providers that we have. Some of the trends that I'd like to point out here is that one of the trends that have been reported in the literature before, which is that more educated learners are being, that the North America and Europe have more educated learners than the rest of the regions. And that's a trend that we can find across most of the providers that we've found. So it's kind of universal. We also found interesting the differences in which platforms attract learners with low education level. For example, we see that in the edX institutions, they're reaching more less educated learners than other global platforms like FutureLearn, and then that there are some platforms which are perhaps a special case like OpenSAP, which have a very high focus on professionals because they have very low amounts of low educated learners, but also low amounts of doctorate learners, and most of them have either a master's degree or a bachelor degree. And probably this is also related to the nature and the scope topic of the courses, which is something that we want to look further in future work. Another interesting finding and trend is that the regional MOOC providers, now we found this in previous work, but now that we look at this at a bigger scale, they're still the ones that are attracting the least educated learners. In the case of EDRAG and Chuetan, with EDRAG with 80% of the learners with a bachelor or lower, and Chuetan with a 78% of the learners with a bachelor or lower. Then we have the gender distribution. And also I would like to point out here again that we are only considering these 2 genders because the way that each platform treats the rest of the possible genders is not homogeneous, so we cannot compare among platforms. So that's why we are only using female and male genders. Some trends that I would like to point out here, we find a consistent gap of wider gender, a consistent wider gender gap in the less developed countries. This is something that have been reported also in most of the literature, and we can see this trend in most of the global providers showing this issue as well. Perhaps some special cases are in OpenSAP and on OpenHPI. As we see, they have a much abrupt gender gap, and again, because their focus is they have a very high focus on professional courses and technical courses. So in most occasions, the enrollment in these courses from women is lower. And the last chart that I have is regarding the age distribution by provider. We have here the age distribution in 7 age buckets that are codified by the color, as you can see here in this legend. And then in the x-axis, we have each one of the, in a stack bar chart, we have each one of the providers and the percentage of learners that fall in each one of these buckets. So a few things to point out here. The first thing that I'd like to point out is that the most common range age or bucket is the learners that fall within 26 or 35 years old. We have only 2 exceptions among all of the MOOC providers, which are OpenHPI that have more learners in the 45-55 bucket. Again, probably related to the more focus on professionals. And then we also have a drag, which is the main bucket is 18 and 25 years old learners. So this is interesting because they are reaching a very young population. Also, we can see that the regional MOOC providers, Drag and Chuetan, have the youngest populations. We can see this over here. And in general, we see that there are important differences in this age distribution. For example, FutureLearn has the most equitable age distribution, and others are less equitable. In general, we think that some of these variations might be linked to the digital literacy and English knowledge of countries that can make the access to some of these age buckets more difficult than for others. And to conclude our work, we find that there are clear differences between the global and regional MOOC providers. Our hypothesis, although we are still at a preliminary stage, is that these regional MOOC providers might be more successful in fulfilling the original goal of MOOCs to reach populations and learners that really want to learn contents and don't have access to this education otherwise. And while we are looking things at a macro scale, we think that this analysis can generate guidelines that can actually help learners at a micro scale. And so perhaps once we keep working on this direction, we can generate guidelines that can help institutions to design more equitable and inclusive courses, or to better design to attract learners from different characteristics and so on. Some of the challenges that I found after talking with lots of MOOC providers or researchers with access to MOOC data was trying to convince them that this research was interesting for them, or globally to the research community and the educational practice community. Some of them lacked the human resources to perform this kind of research, or they saw this research as a tech challenge and they couldn't commit to this, although the tech workload that they had is actually very low because most of the workload is writing the script analysis. And so I want to emphasize that I think that there should be more research conducted in these regional settings, especially because most of these platforms doesn't have the human resources to conduct this kind of research. So I'm hoping to encourage other people to make partnerships with these institutions and do more research. In the future, we are expanding this work with additional MOOC providers. Additionally, we also, of course, welcome to new members. So if you have access to large data set from MOOCs and you found this research interesting, please reach out to me. We want to focus next on more behavioral characteristics and other dimensions like the course type. We want to more specifically compare trends across specific populations between global and regional settings. So for example, see how the Arab learners or the Chinese learners or the Hispanic learners behave differently when learning in a global setting versus a regional setting. And then we're also trying to launch a common survey on learners' perceptions that we're planning to send to the regional MOOC providers, learners, so that we can get some insights, some direct insights through learners on differences when learning in a global or regional setting. And that's all from me. I'm happy to answer any questions that you may have.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Jose. Great presentation. And now we can take questions from the audience. And again, you can